So I'm it tonight, I'm going to do the talk. And as you know, we've been talking about encounters with reality since the new year. And the title of my talk tonight is Reality Calls, Living with Meaning. And sometimes we can't avoid an encounter with reality. Last week, Bodhinaga was talking about the parinirvana of the Buddha, and he was talking about encounters with death. And there's a sense in which, I was going to say most of us, none of us eventually can avoid an encounter with death, which is a very strong encounter with reality. But mostly, reality doesn't present us with something quite as inevitable. Sometimes it does. Sometimes reality is just right there in your face. But some of the time, in fact, I think most of the time, reality calls to us in much, much more subtle ways. It kind of just hints, it just whispers, it just kind of nudges us. And because usually the call of reality is more subtle, it's sometimes very easy to miss it. In fact, quite often it's very tempting to miss it and just quietly turn the other way and get on with living our lives the way we've always lived them. So, the title of tonight's talk, Reality Calls, is indicating something, and it's what I'm going to be talking about is how to notice when reality calls and how to respond, I suppose. So I'm going to start with a couple of stories from the Buddhist tradition. And these are stories about people who reality called on big time. And I'm going to start with probably the most famous of them. And actually, this may be a figure that you have seen pictures of, or even images, those were statues of. It's a very common image in Buddhist art, especially in China, but also sometimes in northern India. And it's a figure that doesn't look like a Buddha at all. It's a figure that looks a bit like a pilgrim. He's quite often holding a pilgrim's staff in his hand. He wears this enormous, enormous hat that keeps off the rain and the sun, keeps the weather out. And he's a bit bowed because on his back he's got this huge, huge pack. It's like the biggest rucksack you've ever seen. And this pack is a stack of rolled scrolls and, what passed in medieval India and China for books, stacks of parchment kind of bound together with ribbons. And this figure, who rejoices in the name Hsuan Tsang, which I've written down here in advance because I know that if I left it until I was talking about it, I wouldn't be able to remember how to spell it. That's one spelling of it, Hsuan Tsang, and this is an alternative spelling of it. And if you go on to Google, you can find another dozen alternative spellings of the name. But anyway, it's pronounced Hsuan Tsang. And he is a person on whom reality called big time. He was a Buddhist monk and a scholar in 7th century China. And he's very famous for having made an epic journey from China to India to bring back and translate Buddhist texts. Now, the journey that he made, the pilgrimage that he made, was a completely epic undertaking from beginning to end. And there's a sense in which, to do him justice, I'd have to spend the whole evening, in fact, probably the whole series of talks on Hsuan Tsang. His travels are very well documented. He had all sorts of adventures. And all I'm going to be able to do now is tell you some of the things that happened to him along the way. So some of the things that happened to him. He was, first of all, he was pursued by royal officials from the Chinese court for leaving China. He wasn't supposed to leave China, and the emperor sent his officials off after him. But he managed to get out. He then got lost in the Taklamakan desert, Having got lost, he managed to spill all of his water supplies, and he almost died of thirst. He was captured by bandits. He got detained against his will by the king in a little kingdom along the way. This king recognised Hsuan Tsang's kind of spiritual wisdom, and he just wanted to keep him because he wanted to get a bit of that. He didn't want to let him go and carry on to India. He was imprisoned at one point. He had to cross snow-covered mountains. He had to cross rivers in flood. He was captured by bandits. So he had quite a time of it. But he did get to India. He visited, I think, probably all of the sites that our pilgrims visited in February. He studied for quite a long time at the Buddhist University of Nalanda in northern India, which our pilgrims also visited. And his pilgrimage in all took not the 3 weeks of the Sheffield pilgrimage, but 16 years, which were probably the best years of his life. He was no longer a young man when he eventually got back to China. And when he did, he brought with him 657 Buddhist works, packed into 520 cases, and he spent the remainder of his life translating those texts into Chinese, as well as teaching about them and writing works of his own about Buddhism. And he founded a school of Buddhism known as the Hsuan School of Buddhism. So, it was an epic quest that he was called upon to make. It was epic both in physical terms, the length of the journey, the dangers of the journey, the adventures that he encountered. And it was also epic in terms of the impact that his pilgrimage had on the world. It was hugely influential in the spread of Buddhism. The fact that he brought back so many Buddhist texts to China meant that the teaching of the Dharma in China kind of really took off from there, and his translations are still used. So, what made him do it? How did he know that reality was calling to him, and did he think about it? Did he think of it in that terms? And how did he respond to the call? So, Hsuan Tsang was actually not brought up as a Buddhist at all. He was brought up in a family of very scholarly Confucian philosophers, Confucian scholars, I suppose. And he converted to Buddhism in his teens. He entered a monastery. He pursued the life of a scholar monk. There were quite a lot of people like that at that time, people who were both very sincere Dharma practitioners, but they made it their business to study Buddhist texts. They devoted their lives really to learning and to delving into Buddhist philosophy. So at the time that he was fairly young and studying and practicing the Dharma, there was a civil war in China. There was a lot of political and social upheaval. And actually, to avoid the civil war, he moved around within China from one place to another. And he tried to make the best of it. He tried to kind of take advantage of the fact that he had to move around, to go to monasteries where there were particular teachers he could learn from, and where there were libraries where he could go and study the texts. So he got around in China, and he found out more or less all that China had to offer in terms of Buddhism and Buddhist texts. But he was very, very dissatisfied with what he found. The texts that he found they were all copies of ones that had originally come from India. Sometimes they were in Sanskrit, but sometimes they were in other languages. They were very often incomplete because they were quite old and they'd travelled huge distances. When he could find copies of the same sutras, then he quite often found there were serious inconsistencies between one copy and another, between the different translations. And he found that time and time again he'd be reading a work And there'd be a reference to some sutra that he just couldn't find in China. There just wasn't a copy of it in China. So he concluded, as many Buddhists in China did, that China had only a very paltry subset of the Buddhist texts that were available in India, which at that time was the heartland of Buddhism. So, in a way, Hsuan Tsang's call began with a longing for wisdom, a longing to just know more about the Dharma, to delve more deeply into the Dharma, and a real dissatisfaction with the limitations that were imposed on him by what was available. And he knew that there was far, far more that he could immerse himself in, if only he could get to India. He knew that not only he, but many other Buddhists in China could benefit if only he could get his hands on some of those texts. And he knew that the only way to do that was to travel from China to India and bring back some texts. But it wasn't quite like today where you can just book a flight. He also knew that, although he talked up with many other Chinese Buddhists, wouldn't it be great to go to China? Wouldn't it be great to bring back some of those sutras that were just missing from the set that they had in China? He knew that for most of them it was just a pipe dream. The dangers of the journey, the length of the journey, were just inconceivable. People just wouldn't consider it at all. To go to India, you had to devote years of your life. You had to go beyond the boundaries of the known world, into territory where you didn't know what you were going to find. You knew that along the way you were going to have to cross deserts. You were going to have to travel through territory where there might be wars, where there were certainly bandits, where there were certainly high mountain ranges to be climbed, where there'd be snow and so on. And so, probably to begin with, Hsuan Tsang just subscribed to the same notion that all of his contemporaries did, which was, well, a nice idea, but just not possible. But the need for the pilgrimage just kept coming back to him. The idea just kept popping up into his consciousness. In a way, reality just kept on nudging him, kept on reminding him that there was a possibility there. And he will have thought about that possibility for years. Well, in fact, he did. He weighed up the pros and cons. He made inquiries. He talked to people about what he might find. He made inquiries with the court about whether he could get a permit to get out of China. It was very difficult to get permission to get out, to leave China in those days. But then, maybe with a little bit of maturity, he decided that he didn't mind about being a bad boy. He had converted to Buddhism from Confucianism in his adolescence, maybe, well, very likely actually, against the wishes of his family. Maybe he'd got beyond just doing what authority expected him to do. And then, the journey to India would be perilous, but then he had done a fair bit of travelling around China, more of a known territory, but he'd got used to travelling. He'd even got used to travelling in war zones, because, as I said, there was a civil war going on in China in those days. Maybe he'd even developed a taste for the adventures of travelling, or maybe he didn't mind them anyway. And then, so he was going in search of Buddhist texts. He would need to be able to recognise those texts when he found them, be able to recognise the real thing from some forgery, recognise whether it was complete, identify how old it was likely to be and what the provenance of the text was. But actually, his studies had equipped him pretty well for that. He was going to have to journey through a lot of different lands. He was going to have to communicate with people who spoke probably tens of different languages along his route. But actually, he had discovered in his travels that he had a bit of an aptitude for learning languages. He'd learned quite a lot of the local Chinese languages, and when he'd stayed in different monasteries, he'd learned other languages in order to be able to read some of the texts in their libraries. So he had an aptitude for languages. That would set him that would help him along the way. But then, on the other hand, there were some ways in which he wasn't well suited at all. And actually, the story of his very first desert crossing, just after he'd left China, suggests that he wasn't terribly practical. And he probably knew this about himself. He wasn't terribly practical. He didn't realise that if you were going to cross a desert, you joined a caravan. He just kind of set off on his own. He bought a horse that just wasn't up to the job. And then, once he got into the desert, he managed to spill all of his water. I mean, that's pretty inept, isn't it? Your most precious possession if you're crossing a desert and you spill it all. So he wasn't a particularly practical man, and he probably realised that too. So, on the one hand, but on the other hand, he was weighing up the pros and cons, but still this idea kept on nagging at him. And the tradition is that the idea of India just kept nagging so much that in the end he went into retreat to reflect on whether or not he should take on this pilgrimage, whether or not he should go. And on retreat, he asked the Bodhisattva Maitreya to guide him. And then he had a significant dream. So this is the dream. So in the dream, he sees a huge mountain at the centre of the earth. And this mountain is made of jewels, and it's in the middle of this great sea. And so in the dream, he tries to walk across the sea to get to the mountain. The mountain's beckoning him. But, it's a sea, it's an ocean, he's got to get across it. He puts his foot in the shallows, and then he finds that when he puts his foot down, a lotus appears under his foot to support it. So he takes another step and another lotus appears, and so he walks on lotuses across the sea to get to the mountain of jewels. Okay, so he's crossed the first hurdle. So he reached the mountain, but when he started to climb the mountain, he kept on slipping backwards. So he'd get up a few steps, slip back down. Did that several times, was beginning to feel that frustration that you often find in dreams where something is just really frustrating you. And then there was a huge sort of stir in the air, and a great wind sprang up and then just carried him from the bottom of the mountain right away to the summit. And he found himself in his dream sitting at the top of this mountain, looking out all around him, and what he could see were all the lands that he would visit if he travelled from China to India. And he said that he woke up with a feeling of great joy and certainty, knowing that he must make the journey. Okay, and so he decided to respond to the call of reality, and the rest is history. So that's the story of Hsuan Tsang and Hsuan Tsang's call, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. Second story is about another very famous Buddhist, a man who was born in the 10th century in a part of northern India which is now Bangladesh, India's subcontinent, I suppose, which is now Bangladesh. So this man, when he was young, he was a Buddhist. He was brought up as a Buddhist in the Vajrayana tradition. He came from a family that all practiced Vajrayana Buddhism, and from an area where that was what was practiced. And actually, he was a very devout Buddhist, but he felt a sort of dissatisfaction with the type of Buddhism that was practiced in his local town, village. He felt that he wanted to go deeper. He wanted more, he needed more depth. And he began to delve into the teachings that were available at that time, which weren't actually in his area very great. He began to look at some of the earliest texts he could find. What he found were some parts of the Pali canon, except that the ones that he looked at weren't in Pali, they were Sanskrit versions. But he began to look at some of those earliest texts. He found those interesting. But actually, what he really wanted to find were some Vajrayana texts. And he wanted to find a Vajrayana teacher who could really help him to go, a Mahayana teacher that could help him to go deeper with the Mahayana tradition. So the Mahayana tradition is it's the great Buddhist tradition that holds as its ideal the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is the mythical being who is devoted to the quest for enlightenment for themselves and for all beings. In a way, you don't have to know too much about what the Mahayana means, but that's briefly what it's about. So, but basically, he wanted a teacher. He wanted a teacher who could really help him to deepen his practice. There wasn't anyone in the area of northern India that he knew about, and eventually he realised that he was going to have to travel. And on making inquiries, he realised that the teacher that he really wanted to go to actually lived in Southeast Asia, in Sumatra. So he was going to have to do what Hsuan Tsang had done several centuries earlier. He was going to have to make a great journey. It didn't take him quite as long as Hsuan Tsang, but it took him 13 months to travel from northeast India to Sumatra. And so this man, he was called Atisha. He did make the epic journey. I'll write up his name here because I can spell it. So Atisha did make the journey to Sumatra. He did find the teacher that he wanted to find. He did learn a great deal. And he did come back to northern India loaded with texts and teachings and, a much more serious and deep Buddhist practitioner than he had been when he left. So he's very pleased with what he'd learned. And when he came back to northern India, he went to the other great Buddhist university of northern India, and he spent a lot of time there teaching, again, a bit like Hsuan Tsang, translating texts, probably leading seminars on his texts and so on. So, So Atisha had a call early in his life. And actually, I think that probably Atisha thought that probably that would be it. He was going to settle down to the life of a monk and a scholar at a university. He had plenty of knowledge to impart, plenty of depth of practice to impart to other Buddhists. And that's what he got on with. But then, in 1024, something unexpected happened. He was contacted by a messenger, a deputation from the regent of Western Tibet. Now, you probably all think of Tibet as a really Buddhist country, and certainly it has been for many centuries. But the tradition is that Buddhism was very first introduced into Tibet in the 8th century by the great sort of mythical figure Padmasambhava. And actually it flourished there for about a century. And then about a century after Padmasambhava's death, Buddhism began to run into problems in Tibet because the various rulers of the different kingdoms of what's now Tibet were hostile to Buddhism. And by the early, so Buddhism went into decline basically. There were only a few sort of small cells of practice that Buddhists that kept on practicing, but it was definitely in decline. And then, by the early 11th century, so shortly before the time that Atisha had his deputation, there were rulers back in Western Tibet that were sympathetic to Buddhism. And the regent of that kingdom was the one who sent the deputation to Atisha, inviting him to Tibet to help to re-establish Buddhism there. Okay, so that was the request. There was a background story to the invitation, and the background story was that the king of Western Tibet was being held hostage. He was being held hostage by bandits, and actually he'd been held hostage by these bandits for several years. And these bandits were demanding as a ransom the weight of the king in gold. And back in Western Tibet, his family were furiously selling off all the family jewels and everything that they could to try and get together the gold to pay the ransom to get the king back. And after several years, messages going backwards and forwards, but after several years, the son of the king, and the king's family, I suppose, sent a message to the king in captivity saying, we're almost there, don't give up. And the king sent a reply, and his reply was, don't waste your money. Don't waste your money paying the ransom of an old man who probably hasn't got many years left to live. Use it instead to take as a gift to Atisha in northern India and invite him to come and re-establish the Dharma in Tibet. So it's quite a story. And Atisha was really moved by the story, and he was really moved by the request. He was very, very doubtful, however, about Tibet. He knew that the journey across the Himalayas was going to be dangerous for all sorts of reasons, not just arduous walking, racing rivers, snow and avalanches, that sort of thing, but he knew as well that there was a reputation. The tribes that inhabited the Himalayan regions were full of bandits. It was full of bandits. It was really dangerous territory. So Atisha was in two minds. It's a bit like Hsuan Tsang. He was in two minds. On the one hand, he could see that in many ways he was a good person to go to Tibet and help re-establish Buddhism. On the other hand, he thought that his travelling days were finished. After the epic journey to Sumatra, he was no longer a young man. And the tradition says that he reflected and meditated, he thought about it, and eventually he asked Tara for guidance. So Tara is the female bodhisattva of compassion. And Atisha is said to have had a special kind of devotion to Tara. So he asked Tara for guidance. And Tara, apparently, in a vision, in his meditation, told him that if he went to Tibet, his remaining lifespan would be considerably shortened by several years, but that in fact he would benefit a great many beings. So, after listening to his intuitions, weighing up the pros and cons, Atisha decided he was going to respond to the call, to his second call, really. He accepted the invitation to go to Tibet and work to spread the Dharma there. And it's said that actually his impact on Buddhism in Tibet was absolutely pivotal. He's credited with saving Buddhism from complete extinction in Tibet, and he made possible the founding, really, of Tibet's first Buddhist order, the Kadam tradition. So, two very, very famous Buddhist figures, Hsuan Tsang and Atisha. And both people who just experienced very strongly a call to do something that was really important for them, in a way made their lives meaningful, but also had a huge impact on the world. So, how is this relevant to us? Some of us might be quite inspired by the idea of the great quest, the call to, do something that's really difficult and heroic. But most of us probably will dismiss these stories as just not relevant to us. They sound difficult and dangerous. Some of us probably think, well, thank goodness that I don't have to do things like that. But I think it is. I think these stories are relevant to us for a number of reasons. And firstly, actually, I wouldn't dismiss too quickly the idea of there being a great quest waiting for any one of us. And I'll just give you some examples of great quests that people have undertaken. So, nearly 30 years ago, when he first came across the Dharma, Vidanya gave up his well-paid job working for British Coal. He sold his very nice house in Nether Edge, and he went to the Spanish mountains to help build a retreat centre. It's quite a quest, really. In the 1990s, Amoghavamsa and Suryavajra and Susiddhi left their communities and their right livelihood jobs in Norwich and Glasgow respectively, and they brought the Dharma to the wild people of Sheffield. And, to this day, there are order members in remote parts of the world working often on their own to try and bring the Dharma to people in Moscow, South Africa, Venezuela, all sorts of remote parts of the world. So there are plenty of people who are still undertaking heroic quests. Okay, so maybe the circumstances of our lives and maybe our capabilities make us unsuited to take on a great quest of that sort. But actually, it doesn't mean that we can't live with meaning, and it doesn't mean that reality doesn't beckon to us. Indeed, I think there's a sense in which reality never stops beckoning to us, if we only have the capacity to hear it. There's a sense in which we are all called to do not just one thing, but lots of things. We're called to live with meaning, to make sense of our lives. And that might be a call in the external or in the internal sense. We might be called externally to a particular sort of work. We might be called to develop a particular interest, something that fascinates us, like music or art or writing. We might be called to live in a particular situation or to get involved in particular projects. And actually, quite a few of us have responded to calls of that sort. A lot of us are doing jobs that we've been called to, or involved in things that we feel a real resonance, a real pull towards. And then internally, well, there are all sorts of things that we might be called to do. Just making ourselves calmer and kinder can be quite a call, and quite a challenge actually, sometimes as challenging as some of the things that Hsuan Tsang faced. Tackling a habit, a particularly unskillful and deeply rooted habit, can be really, really difficult. And sometimes just making a commitment, just deciding that we are going to go for it, whatever it is, can be quite challenging too. So, I think there's a sense in which we do all have a call, or many calls. We all have the capacity for responding to external events. A lot of us will make the excuse that we can't change things in our lives, that we need to earn the money, or we need to do this, or we need to do that. If you're one of those people who says, well, of course I can't do anything like that, well, maybe you should think again, because there are all sorts of things we can do. There was a time, a lot of years in my life actually, where I thought, well, I can't possibly work in a right livelihood or work at the Buddhist Centre. I'm working to support Vidanya so that he can work at the centre, and I've got to work in a proper job. In 2007, when an opportunity came up, we kind of looked at what we needed to live on, and we thought, we could live on less than half of what I earn. And that's the point at which I came to work at the Buddhist Centre. So quite often, when you think you're hedged in by external difficulties, it isn't necessarily the case. And we've all got the capacity for internal development. We've all got the capacity for a spiritual quest. In fact, probably none of us would be here tonight if we didn't. There's a sense in which we've all listened at some point to the kind of impulses and intuitions that brought us, first of all, to the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and that then led many of us into deciding that we become a mitra, deciding that we were going to train for ordination, and then sustained us through the long path that was involved in that, to some of us getting ordained. So sometimes the internal work can be every bit as challenging as the epic journeys of Atisha and Hsuan Tsang. Okay, so I want to say a little bit next about who or what it is that calls. Because if Buddhism doesn't have a God, then, well, what is it that calls us? And I think there are different ways of framing this. I think there's a kind of inner way, and there's a mythical way, and there's an outer way of framing what it is that does the calling. I think the inner way is to think, well, okay, so what's calling is my potential self, my possible future self is calling me. The person that I could be is calling on me, beckoning me towards the future the future potential that I could fulfill. There's the mythical way of framing it, and both Hsuan Tsang and Atisha thought in mythical terms. So they both thought that they were being strongly encouraged by a bodhisattva, by Maitreya in one case and Tara in the other. And actually these days we don't naturally think in those terms. But for those of us who've developed a particular sort of resonance with one of the Buddhas or bodhisattvas, well, asking for their guidance is a bit like asking our future potentially enlightened selves for guidance. So I think the mythical way can work for many of us too. And the kind of external way to think about it is, and this is the way that I most often think about it, is, well, the universe is calling us. Reality itself is calling us. Reality wants to evolve. It wants to be as fully conscious, as creative, as kind, and as beautiful as it possibly can be. And we are the universe, we're part of it. So we are reality, we're part of reality. And, reality is beckoning to us. It's beckoning to us to play the biggest and best role that we possibly can, to contribute as much as we can to evolution, to making reality as great as it could be. Okay. How do we know when we're being called? So I'm going to talk about some of the different ways in which reality can call us. Because it calls in different voices and sometimes at different volumes. I suppose the first thing to say about this is that we need to ensure that if reality calls us, we will actually hear. And that means developing some spiritual receptivity, which sounds very technical, but actually it's very straightforward. I suppose externally and practically, it means creating enough time and space in our lives when we're not busy doing stuff that we actually can hear the nudgings of reality. There's certainly been times in my life when I've been so busy getting on with what I'm doing to pay any attention to the call of reality. And actually that might be fine for a while, but especially if what we're doing is skillful, especially if it is benefiting the world. But if that's how we consistently live, month after month, year after year, then we're not going to hear when reality whispers in our ear. So most Buddhists actually deliberately create space so that they will hear if reality calls. That's what retreats are for, especially the silent bits of retreats, especially solitary retreats. That's why Buddhists meditate, of course. That's why many Buddhists do what I do many days, and just carve out a little bit of time. For me, it's first thing in the morning, where I can just sit quietly. I just sit quietly with nothing that I've got to think about or got to do, so that there's a sense in which, well, yeah, reality can call. Ideas can bubble up. Things can occur to me. For me as well, I can create a bit of mental space by just doing some gentle physical activity. Ideas often occur to me when I'm weeding the garden, just quietly getting on with pulling out weeds, or going for a walk. And then internally, spiritual receptivity means, I suppose, listening to the voice of our Shraddha. Okay, so Shraddha, for those of you who haven't heard the term before, it's sometimes translated as faith. But it's more accurately described by Sangha Night, the founder of our movement, as the response of what's ultimate in us to what's ultimate in the universe. And of course, what's ultimate in the universe is reality itself. The way things are, I suppose, enlightenment. So you could call Shraddha a kind of spiritual intuition. And that Shraddha can feel like an inner voice that's just kind of prompting us, just pushing us. It can feel like the future beckoning to us. And it might take many forms. And here are just a few of them. So it might take the form of gut feelings and intuitions. I can't remember how long it was, but a month or so ago I did a short talk here about some of my experiences in a job that I worked in the 1990s at an organisation called Dial UK. And I won't repeat that story, but it was a big job for me. It was a very important job for me. The day before I went for my interview at Dial UK, I went for a walk, I can remember it really vividly, from Bakewell, along the Derwent Valley, up into Lady Manners Wood, and then through the Chatsworth Estate. It was a lovely, lovely walk, but what I remember really vividly is just feeling, it's almost like rushes of energy. I knew that this interview and this job was going to be really, really important for me. And I had no idea why, but I knew it was going to be really important. Okay, so that's one thing. Intuitions and gut feelings. Dreams are another. Hsuan Tsang had his wonderful dream about the big mountain. And, well, I don't think that everything that passes through our mind in sleep has huge significance, but my own experience is that there are dreams that wake me up. There are dreams where I wake up in the middle of the night and I remember vividly what the dream was. And those dreams, I usually think I'm meant to remember. And I usually do reflect on them. And sometimes they're a complete mystery to me. And sometimes I kind of get what they're getting at. Not always. Vidanya tells a really nice story of someone who had a dream. And in this dream, someone was holding up a placard. And when he read the placard, it said, "Stop smoking dope." Okay, so my dreams aren't that explicit, but some people need it spelling out. Other things, other ways in which reality calls, recurrent ideas, fascinations, obsessions, they can all be the future beckoning. I think my lifelong obsession with gardening, fascination with gardening is a better word, means that I was uniquely placed to be able to help with the 2 acres of land that we got when we got this Buddhist Centre. I think Maitreya Dasa's fascination with India means that he was uniquely placed to be able to take people from Sheffield on pilgrimage to northern India and kind of connect us all, connect the whole Sangha with the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree. And, I don't think of myself as someone who has visions in the way that Atisha had visions, but I do actually often, in my meditation, just in my mind's eye, I see Sheffield Buddhist Centre. For me, the Buddha in the belfry is iconic, so it's the Buddha in the belfry I see. And actually, sometimes in my meditation, I see the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, kind of hovering over the Buddhist Centre. And then during rituals, I often have a real sense of the archetypal Buddhas and Bodhisattvas hovering over us as well. So, maybe that's what Atisha experienced, or maybe he did really see a vision of Tara, who knows. Sometimes the call can manifest as a voice. So Acharya, one of the order members who practices here, described to me how when he was about to go through the door of the room, or the building I think it was, where he was going to attend his first week of an introductory course, he said, "A voice said to me, going through that door will change your life. Are you ready for this?" And he went through, and it did change his life, actually. But he said he experienced it as a real voice. Okay. I'm just deciding what I'm going to concentrate on. Okay, so other things. Gifts and talents could point us towards things that we're called to do. I think that my particular set of aptitudes and skills, the skills that I picked up during a very unconventionally varied career, have made me uniquely suited to being the chair of Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I think that Vidanya's talent for words called him, in a way, to inspire the Sangha of Sheffield with his talks. And I also don't discount coincidences. So this is my last example. When I was getting near to ordination, I needed to find a preceptor, someone who would actually ordain me. And I wasn't sure who to ask. Knew quite a few order members, both in Sheffield and at the retreat centres, the women's retreat centres. But suddenly, and inexplicably, because neither of us had changed any of our routines, I kept bumping into Punyamala. Not just at the Buddhist Centre, not just here, but in the street, at the shops. It was absolutely extraordinary. For years and years, I had never met her apart from at the Buddhist Centre, and suddenly I bumped into her, time and time again, more than once a week often. And I took that as a sign that I should ask her to be my preceptor, and she accepted. And I've always been very pleased with that choice. Okay, how do we know? How can we tell the difference between the call of reality and any old just harebrained scheme, any ego-serving scheme? We can all get carried away with enthusiasms, and it might be easy to convince ourselves that we're being called to do something. I think that in the words of Sangha, we need to test our intuitions in the light of reason and experience. We need to do what Hsuan Tsang and Atisha did. We might feel a call, we might feel strong promptings to do something, but we do need to weigh up the pros and cons. We do need to find out a bit about what's involved. We do need to think, well, is there a reasonable chance? Am I the best person to do this? And I think there are some characteristics that are important for the call. I think that if you're being called to do something, usually it's something that will benefit the world and other beings. I think often, though not always, it's challenging, even scary. I think that because of that, it usually will be something that makes us grow. And it is always something that will give meaning to our lives. Ultimately, it will lead us to lead meaningful lives and therefore to make us happier. Okay, so obviously a lot of people hear the call of reality and ignore it. In fact, quite often it's much more comfortable to ignore it. Hsuan Tsang could have chosen just to be the respected monk scholar. Atisha could have rested on his laurels at the university. And society and conventional opinion will often discourage us from responding to the call. Convention tells us we should accrue possessions and guard our security and plan for our pension. And of course there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But if they're ends in themselves, if they're too important to us, they're just going to pull us out of shape and stop us responding to the things that our intuition tells us are really important to us. So if we hear an inner voice calling to us to change our lives, to take our lives seriously, to embark on some exciting and risky path, we shouldn't get scared, bottle out. We need really to respond with courage. And responding with courage probably means thinking about, how seriously should I take this? It probably means verbalising what we're thinking of doing, what we think we're called to do. It probably means talking about that with our friends, discussing it, testing it in the light of their reason, their experience. In the end, it probably means grasping the nettle and doing it. There's a lovely bit at the beginning of a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra called the Ratnaguna Samchaya Gata. that says that listening to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas is for heroic spirits intended. There's a sense in which practicing Buddhism isn't necessarily meant to be the easy option. It does require a bit of courage. So the first step is listening to our tuition, listening to Shraddha, listening to the call of reality. Okay, so that's the call of reality. And I suggest that we split into groups in a few minutes. And I'm going to suggest that in the groups we talk about whether reality has called us in the past, and perhaps is it calling us now? Do we experience a call? And there will be a number of different groups. I think all of the different rooms are occupied. I think that there will be a group for the people who have just recently finished an intermediate course on Saturday mornings, and that group will meet in the new room with some of the people who led that course, Kenneth Suri and others. There will be a group tonight for the young persons group. So if you're young, you can go into the Red Shrine Room. If you're young, you can go into the Red Shrine Room with Alice and other members of the young persons group. This is something that we do once a month. We have a group just for young people. And we do it on the Tuesday before there's going to be a young persons meeting on the Saturday. And if any of you are interested in the young persons group, you go to the group with Alice in the Red Shrine Room and find out more about it. And you can always talk to Alice at any time about that group. Sorry?
Under 40.
Under 40, okay. My definition of young, okay. If you're under 40, you can go to that group. There'll be a group for the people who, quite some time ago now, finished the intermediate course on Wednesday evenings, and that will be in the green room as usual, and then remaining women assemble in the bookshop, remaining men assemble up here.